Broadcasting from the North Fulton studio of Business RadioX, it's time for North Fulton Voices. This show is brought to you by the North Fulton Improvement Network, addressing the workforce housing crisis in our region. Now, here are your hosts.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another edition of North Fulton Voices. I'm John Ray, alongside Jack Murphy and Nancy Diamond from the North Fulton Improvement Network. Jack, Nancy, welcome.
Thanks, John.
Thanks.
It's great to be here.
Hey, great to have both of you here. Hope both of you had a great holiday time, and we're back ready to work here in January 2025. And today we've got a very interesting show for you. We are going to talk with leaders in our neighboring city of Woodstock and learn about one housing solution they are implementing, the accessory dwelling unit. Jack, what is an accessory dwelling unit?
Thanks, John. We're talking about homes with additional living spaces, sometimes called garage apartments, guest cottages, carriage houses, in-law suites. Some of the most treasured historic homes in the South have these extra buildings, but many have restrictions that keep cities keep homeowners from building those units. So we have a few little data points about ADUs, as they're known in the industry. In 2023, nationwide, ADUs that had been built were 3.3 billion, and that's projected to triple by 2030 to 10 billion, 10.6 billion. According to Porch.com, ADUs make up roughly 2% of all homes in the country. In America's biggest cities, a home with an ADU is priced 35% higher on average than those without one. Georgia is in the top 10 for growth in the ADU market. In Savannah, among homes for sale, those that have an ADU cost an average of 3 times more than a typical home. So it's good for the homeowner in a number of ways. And yet ADUs are largely prohibited or really restricted in many cities. So today we have some experts on this, experts in the fact that they know a lot about it and they have a lot of experience. So we'll start. Tracy, why don't you introduce yourself and then introduce your partners?
Good afternoon, everyone. My name's Tracy Albers. I'm with the City of Woodstock, and I'm the city's Community Development Director. With us from our department is Cameron Dunn, who was actually the project planner on the ordinance update that we did. And then it's my pleasure to introduce the mayor of the City of Woodstock, Michael Caldwell.
Well, thank you. And we're all very glad to be here. You shared data from a whole lot of other cities, which means we can't pretend we invented ADUs now, but we did revamp our ordinance. We want to make sure that this is an active part of our housing inventory in the city and that we're making this available to the homeowners who live in our city. Obviously, you got a 300,000 unit housing deficit here in Metro Atlanta. You've got 4 million unit housing deficit here nationally. We've got to bridge that, and we've got to do it fast and appropriately and in a way that drives wealth for the community, and ADUs are a spectacular way to do that.
Thanks, Mayor. We've seen a number of cities up their ADU game, and Woodstock is probably the closest one to us. Why did you decide to update your ADU rules and policies?
Yeah, I want to point to both of these to talk about specifically how they came across ADUs and what got them interested here. I'll tell you, for me in general, I believe all American public policy is American housing policy, period. And if we don't get serious about bridging this housing gap, we are abandoning the concept of an American middle class. We built the American middle class on American home ownership. It's been 3 generations. We built the largest wealth generating mechanism in human history, engaged in the largest public-private partnership in human history between federally subsidized mortgage interest rates, state tax code incentivizing ownership, local zoning law incentivizing ownership. We built a nation of homeowners. 65% of our nation owned their property. And in doing that, we built a nation of people who had a wealth generating asset. It was an appreciating capital asset. And then we hit 2008 and the recession knocked out half the developers in the nation. Banks stopped lending to build. And we went through a rut where just last year, Metro Atlanta caught up to the number of building permits that we'd issued in 2011. So we are so far behind on keeping up with inventory for the next generation of Americans. I mentioned earlier, we have a 300,000, I think it's almost 350,000 unit housing deficit in just the core 5 counties here in this region. And so we've got to get serious about this, especially given that in Metro Atlanta, we're adding 2 million. We expect to add the population of Nashville to Metro Atlanta by 2050. So if we don't get serious about this now, we recognize, number one, housing prices will continue to skyrocket, but more importantly, the next generation who is now objectively making more money than their parents did at their age, even adjusted for inflation, they are currently objectively poorer than their parents were, and they have no pathway out of that to mimic the wealth generation of their parents, grandparents, and now great-grandparents. So this wealth generating mechanism, that American middle class, the political stability that comes with that middle class is what built Pax Americana. This impacts the whole world. So when we talk about American public policy, we can't talk about it separate from housing policy. And step one for that is inventory. So for me, this has been a wildly exciting policy area because there is no single silver bullet in American housing. But accessory dwelling units give you an opportunity to create additional inventory out of existing inventory, as opposed to almost every other route we have, which is either redevelopment or net new development. This is that sort of beautiful threading the needle in between, where we get to encourage our existing property owners to also contribute to adding inventory into the city.
Yeah, I think that this ordinance, this idea came from an increase in demand. We were seeing a very large increase in demand happening amongst our single-family homeowners. A lot of folks coming into City Hall.
ADUs, not just housing in general, but specifically this. Yeah.
Specifically for ADUs coming into City Hall, speaking to us and saying, hey, how do I do this? What do we do about it? And for a large portion of the city, ADUs were already allowed by right. They were allowed in most, if not all, single-family zones. So we realized from our position as planners and as from the community development department that we needed to clarify what our requirements were. We needed to add some additional clarifying language to guide homeowners in the right direction and to be able to meet that demand more efficiently as time went on. So,
prior to joining the organization, I grew up in the Midwest originally, and shortly after I got my graduate degree, I relocated to Southern California, spent 17 years there in several different communities. And one of the things that I experienced was overly burdensome regulatory policies in jurisdictions that precluded ADU construction from occurring. But that doesn't mean it still wasn't happening. It was just unpermitted illegal units. And so I think one of the perspectives that I brought to the table was making sure that in communities where you do have allowances for this, you provide clear, transparent information about how they can be constructed in such a way that you ensure safe, habitable spaces for whoever may be occupying those, young or old. And so that was the perspective that I brought to the table.
So on that front, the whole ordinance is 6 pages, and there's 2 of them are whereases and all the signatures and all that. So it's really a 4-page document. How did you simplify it? Was this a template from another community, or was this something you guys came up with?
No, it wasn't a template. I think most, if not all, ordinances kind of go through their usual processes. We do, I refer to it as code shopping, where we'll look at sister cities, cities of similar sizes, cities equidistant from other metro areas to see what they're doing, see if they have a different perspective that maybe we're not considering within our Atlanta metro. But like I said earlier, it's building off of existing policy. It's taking what we already had, and if it's not perfectly clear, expanding on it. But yeah, it's taking something that already was a net good thing, which was allowing ADUs by right in most, if not all, of our single family districts, and saying, okay, now what do we mean by this? How do you achieve this? And from a process perspective, how do we cite this? How do we orient this? Questions that were being asked to us by residents, but we didn't have clear answers to. So it created itself for us, basically. We knew what questions residents were asking. We knew the demand was there. So the question then becomes, okay, let's meet it. Let's provide them the answers to the questions they are already asking. So, yeah.
So the law was already allowing for ADUs, but in your comprehensive plan under the third goal, you want to ensure land development is predictable, fair, and cost effective. There are lots of communities that don't seem to be taking that view. So is that just something that's always been Woodstock, that you have allowed ADUs? Is that what you've always been going through?
Can I just say how incredibly fantastic it is to be on a podcast where you've read our comprehensive plan?
Nerd Nirvana.
This is where we want to be. Yeah. So I guess important for your listeners too. Here in Fulton, I imagine you all know Woodstock because we're a pretty incredible playground now. But what I don't know is that we've done a good enough job necessarily setting the stage for sort of where Woodstock is currently too. So just like North Fulton's experienced a truckload of growth in the last 3 decades, the city of Woodstock proper was 4,500 people in 1990. We're 40,000 today. We're now the 20th largest city in the state. You've got somewhere just shy of 120,000 people with a Woodstock address. But more importantly, our downtown had more than 3 million visitors last year. So it's one of the most visited downtowns in the Southeast now, which creates not just infrastructure challenges, but a massive housing demand that we sort of have two different pressures hitting this ADU valve, right? You have the inherent housing demand that comes from a nationwide shortage, plus the fact that we're actually in a really neat live, work, play community that people want to be in, which pushes that down upward pressure hard. And then you have the downward pressure of ADUs are great. Yes, they're great owner homestead owned rental properties, but they also make for great senior living. So maybe mom and dad are getting older. They're not quite ready to go into assisted living. I want to keep them close. Now I have an option for that. Maybe it's my kid is just getting started in their career. They're not quite ready to get out. They're still in school. They're commuting to school. It gives me options there. So we've got in what is genuinely a very mosaic and mixed community, you have a lot of different life stages and needs. And an accessory dwelling unit creates such a unique inventory opportunity to meet those needs in a non-traditional way. And when I say non-traditional, it's almost hilarious to say, because I poked fun at, we invented ADUs at the start of this. These are 5,000-year-old concepts, right? Like if you were living in medieval England, the idea was not, I'll go find another house to put mom and dad up in. It was, okay, great. Well, what can we do over the carriage, right? And so this is leaning back into just the general principle of human development and what's logical and makes sense. So yes, historically, they've always been permitted in most zones within the city. The challenge was it wasn't in any way clear how to actually do that. So neither for staff nor for a resident who might want to execute on that. And so leaning back into Tracy's history outside of the state, I'm willing to wager that we saw quite a bit of that here in our hometown as well, of people saying, hey, you know what, we're going to go ahead and build that ADU. And who knows whether it's legal. And so trying to ensure not just that we have a regulatory environment that allows for these things, but makes this as simple as we possibly can, while also still, yes, preserving the character of the area, but ensuring that we're building safe, effective units as well. That was the goal here. So yes, we have this thing permitted. How do we now do it in a way, in a format that makes it obvious to homeowners that they can do it and simple for them to do it, so that we might actually see it executed on?
So this is, I guess, a political question in a way. You've not only have we read your comp plan, we've read your housing study. So obviously this has been a topic for a while. This has been a topic for a while. How has this been received, this housing conversation in the community?
Yeah, that's a great question. I want to hear how they've heard this too, as people have actually gotten to come in and use it. There's two questions in there. There's the general housing conversation, and then there's the ADU question. So starting with the ADU question, I can say from an elected official's perspective, it's in many ways been a non-issue. I would love to tell you, oh man, I'm getting reelected on that ADU issue. I don't think your average homeowner cares enough. I also don't think it bothered anyone. And I think we're in a very staunch private property rights area. And so there's an element of this where people like the idea that we're telling them, hey, do what you want with your property. I think most Americans, particularly in our area, recognize, hey, it makes sense that you might need space for your kid. It makes sense that you might need space for mom and dad to come back. So I think from a political messaging standpoint, ADUs are easy because they make sense to people. They're rational. From a housing perspective, I am genuinely shocked on a daily basis how receptive our city is to this conversation over and over and over again. And I think it's because they're watching their kids have a tremendously difficult time getting started. And we all recognize that's a problem. We're all looking around at the economy right now going, how does this make sense? How can the Dow be where it is and my kid can't get a start? And that all comes back to American housing. And so I think people are warming to this idea that it matters far more who owns a unit and has access to own a unit than it does how many walls it shares, than it does how many floors and ceilings it shares. Give me a building of condominium units owned by the residents in them versus a rental single family unit neighborhood. And I can tell you which one's building more wealth for Woodstock families. And I think as we continue to build that narrative out and recognize that words like single family and multifamily are misnomers, they don't matter. What matters are things like ownership-rentership ratios. What matters are things like accessibility and opportunity to get into those units. The more that we can continue to reframe that conversation, I'm finding a receptive population to that. I think the key, at the same time that we're pitching this messaging, we are also making the largest infrastructure investment in Woodstock's history, both by quantity of projects and by dollars spent. So there's not a major roadway in our city that isn't either currently being rebuilt and reinvented or on cue to be within the next 5 years. And I think that's the key to having this conversation responsibly, is yes, density is not a bad word. Density done right is a really effective, good thing for the next generation. But you have to meet that with infrastructure that will allow for that not to ruin the lives of the people who are here already. So as long as we're doing this in a responsible manner where we're meeting that new market demand with infrastructure, I'm finding a receptive constituency to it.
Cam, Tracy, have you had much pushback? You're the ones that would get the calls at midnight.
Not necessarily during the public hearing process for this ordinance, taking it through Planning Commission and Council. There was not a whole lot of resident pushback. And I think the large reason for that is that there is a recognition amongst City of Woodstock residents that, yes, pricing is high. It's difficult. We have definitely a lot of people in our community that have raised their children there, that have taken them through the school system. But we also have a lot of people being ushered into the community. It's an attractive place that people want to enter into. So I think between the folks that have lived there for a while and have seen things develop around them or are seeking to live there, between those two demographics, there is that recognition. Pricing is high, but I don't think people necessarily balked at the added density that an ADU is perceived at sometimes. I think both of those demographics, the people who have seen Woodstock grow around them and the people who saw that growth and were attracted to it, recognize that Woodstock, its urban core, its density, done responsibly, the way that we have done it is not going to cause necessarily that many problems. But I also think that there's a recognition amongst Woodstock residents that this investment in their property will return for them, whether if it is providing that place for a generation, whether older or younger, to remain, accrue capital, or provide peace of mind for that matter. They recognize that their investment will not be in vain for that. And I think, I'm grateful to work in a community that has that mindset. It's an increasing rarity and it's lovely. So that's my 2 cents on that one.
I was just going to add, I have friends, I have colleagues, I have people that I encounter in my day-to-day life in Woodstock, and I can't tell you the number of times that someone has sent me a Zillow listing and said, okay, we're looking at this house. Could we convert the basement? Could we add an ensuite? Could we add an ADU? Could it be new construction or could we convert the garage? So it's certainly something on everyone's mind. It's just the path of travel, the end goal is a little bit different. And one of the things I appreciate about our ordinance is I always joke there's a Goldilocks amount of regulatory framework. Not too much, not too little, just right. In the sense that it provides predictability in terms of development and what you can expect in single family neighborhoods, but also in the same breath, it allows you to tailor what you're putting forward to your end audience, whether again, that's a parent, a child, an attempt to build liquidity. I think that's something that we're always striving for, is that Goldilocks amount where you can ensure predictability, but also tailor your experience.
Well, and it's so important too that predictability meets the flexibility that allows you to meet a changing market.
Correct.
Right? The conversations we're having today are different than the conversations we would have all had about housing 10 years ago. and certainly different than 30 years ago. So I agree. I love that Goldilocks approach.
And it's also, I would be remiss if I didn't bring the planner perspective. It has to be flexible enough to account for all of the different types of lots.
Every special snowflake development.
Sure, exactly. I certainly think that a lot of, I think the big gripe that a lot of people have with urban planners sometimes is they don't really get the construction environment. They will create ordinances that are antithetical or difficult to adapt to a construction environment, or taking things from an idea to a reality. I don't think that our ordinance butts up against that too much, and I appreciate that.
Well, I hope I say thank you to the two of you often enough, but part of what I love about your department, part of what I love about the city of Woodstock in general is I think we set a very high bar and we have a high standard, but we come in with a yes if mentality. So how do we get to a yes? Let's figure out how we do these things within our city and do it in a way that meets the Woodstock standard.
So it seems like in recent years, with the farmhouse kind of style, that we've seen a number of developments come in with carriage house kind of setups, detached garage, maybe a breezeway. So those HOAs would maybe cover that. If you are in an HOA now, maybe something built in 2000, and it's probably not in the covenants, are you, I want to say, protected? If you're a homeowner who's concerned about ADUs coming into your HOA neighborhood, what is the policy there?
So we don't preclude HOAs from enforcing their own CC&Rs against properties. So if you've moved into a neighborhood that has restrictions on the books regarding ADUs, we're not looking to impede upon that or erode that right had by the HOA. That being said, in the same breath, if you're moving into a community, I think when we're interacting with potential homeowners, we always tell them, if this is something that you're looking to accomplish in the future on this potential piece of property, you need to find out what those CC&Rs are so that you don't find yourself purchasing something and then having a bit of buyer's remorse when you find out that you may not be able to exercise your rights the way that you think you're entitled to.
Sure. So, and conversely, I guess if you wanted your neighborhood to start allowing it, you would need to go through the bylaws change.
HOA bylaws process. Yeah. And I guess it's important too for any Woodstock resident listening to, even if we wanted to override that, I don't think state law would even permit us to do it.
Sure. So yeah, we're not invading neighborhoods that don't want them. It's just an opportunity for those
private property owners who are not already restricted to do it and do it effectively and predictably.
I think one thing though we are starting to hear whispers about is wholesale subdivisions coming forward with the ADU constructed and incorporated into the project in its infancy. So the idea that the HOA would disallow an ADU is a bit of a fallacy right up front because it's built into the single family property.
Which talk about changing markets.
Indeed. Yeah, really. That's a huge change. So do you have a lot of land available for those kind of subdivisions? Have you got a lot of buildable land left?
We are, I'd say a twofold question. We're running short on greenfield space, although we have an annexation growth boundary agreement done with the county. So the future boundaries of the city, that's fairly true, but less true than it is within the current incorporated bounds. But we're definitely within the next decade going to be shifting fairly heavily into redevelopment versus greenfield development.
So you talk about you've had calls for this. What's the average request? Why are they doing it? How much space are they looking for? What are they looking for? Is there a pattern?
Yeah, I think a lot of the patterns come from existing infrastructure. The amount of times we've gotten calls where people are like, hey, I have this detached garage. It's kind of just sitting here. What is the process for converting this? Or, hey, I have this shed out back and I would love to do something with it other than store lawn equipment. What is the process for doing that? People varying in their knowledge of planning terms will maybe ask about setbacks. People will maybe ask about, how it should look. But I think that people recognize very intimately what they have on their property and the ability of it to develop. So I think a lot of it came from, I have this idea and I need to see if it's feasible before I start with it. And those calls were increasing in frequency. We were getting 1 to 2 a month. So it was, I think, high time that we started moving on it. So that's the typical back and forth I would usually get. Start with a phone call, follow-up email, maybe a second, and then take it from there.
I think something we experience is folks that are a little almost afraid to ask what their real end game question is. And it's, something like, well, my mother-in-law moved in with us here the last couple years, and, maybe we'd like to set aside some space exclusively for her. Is that something? And so there's a lot of inquiries had and interactions had with the public where we're kind of peeling away layers of the onion to get to what the end ask is.
They don't want to be on record with anything.
That's right.
Yeah, if I did that 3 years ago, would that?
And I think that's why, we put forward some materials, we've created some informative handouts to take the fear factor away a little bit and make some of the concepts that are in our code that maybe seem a little arduous or a little prescriptive and dumb them down a little bit so they don't seem so scary and something that's not insurmountable. So that way, when we have this dialogue with the public, we can, again, get to the heart of the matter, answer questions, get them to their end goal as quickly and seamlessly as possible.
So you have a really nice one-pager with colors and pictures and, for us visual learners, it's a wonderful piece, and we'll link to that in the show notes going forward. I want to talk about attached versus detached, because there are some places we've seen, even here in North Fulton, sure, we allowed ADUs as long as they're attached. And that to me doesn't feel like an ADU. Have you had that conversation? And does it make a difference in the end number of users in the home if it's attached or detached?
I think we had quite an extended conversation about this with our building department as we were crafting this ordinance. Firstly, we were worried about how does this interact with the building code? What improvements are homeowners going to need to make to their existing property to accommodate an attached unit? The answers being they might have to upgrade the wall that holds the primary unit versus the accessory unit. The question then follows of, okay, what about access? Can you access it from the interior of the home? Our answer in our ordinance was, if it's going to be accessory, then no. But thirdly, it's how it interacted with our own zoning. If you are taking something and you are combining it to a single family home, does that become an attached unit? And I think the answers that we landed on were the building portion of it is entirely separate from our zoning perspective on it. The building code and the things that need to be accomplished in order to develop that unit will have to happen anyway throughout the build-out process. But secondly, determining that ADUs should be separate. They should have separate access. They should be complement but not take away from the primary unit. And it doesn't explicitly say in our ordinance, this is need to be detached or attached. It kind of blankets it to be able to provide both. But there were definitely conversations on how do we approach this in a way that is considering all of the factors that would be at play throughout the construction timeline of something.
I think historically you've probably seen more detached or carriage house type accessory dwelling units. I tend to be a bigger proponent for attached units for two reasons. Number one, generally speaking, they're easier to finance because you're working within an existing footprint versus new wholesale construction. So that's the first thing that I tend to latch on to. The second thing is for persons that are interested in maintaining the character of single family neighborhoods, you don't have yet another accessory structure that can possibly lead to overdevelopment or overbuilding of single family lots. Again, you're working and repurposing existing space within that footprint of your single family home. And I can't admittedly fault anyone who wants to take existing space within their single family home and repurpose it in such a way that it has better utility for them and may generate better equity for them over the long term. So I tend to see attached structures and conversions as being something very, very lucrative that's maybe a little easier grasp for especially newer single family homeowners.
So I think this is why our code allows for either. And rhetorically, for me, as we're trying to change this public framework, this again matches back to how I want us to start thinking about single versus multifamily conversation, right? It doesn't really matter. To your point, when we look at that unit and you go, well, it's attached now as a single family or multifamily. Can you access them together, or is it really just the basement, or is it an accessory dwelling? Now, the real question is not, are they touching each other or aren't they? Are they single units or are they separate units? And that is such a more rational way to think about housing. Do I have separate units, individual units? It doesn't matter whether they share a wall or don't share a wall. Is it an individual unit or not? And then in doing that, figuring out, okay, on that individual lot, does it make more sense to be attached to the original dwelling or not? Great. We just want the accessory dwelling unit. We want you to have the ability to execute on it.
Well, I think that also speaks to the point of the ordinance defines what an ADU is, but more importantly, it defines what it isn't. I don't think we are in the business of regulating how someone puts an addition onto their home. If it is access from within the interior single family, then I don't think that it's our place to be adding regulations.
Or a doghouse.
Exactly.
Well, it just doesn't seem like it's really a density question, because you could just as easily have more kids in that house or more relatives or somebody living in the basement.
And I'll give the credit of, this is why I think it's so important when we have housing policy discussions, we have to have infrastructure conversations as well, because I will give the credit to critics that, yes, if we actually en masse add ADUs throughout the city, you are very likely to be adding wheels on the road. And so as long as we are also investing in our infrastructure to meet that demand, this is an effective tool by which we meet the demand for housing. We lose if we don't keep up with our infrastructure. We also lose if we don't keep up with our housing inventory.
But one of the points we've made repeatedly is those wheels on the ground, hopefully, are going to jobs in Woodstock,
right,
as opposed to going to jobs in here.
Which, as all good public policy conversations do, brings us to yet another policy issue, which is commercial diversification and attracting employment. So whenever we I always tease, I think this is a two-sided coin, right? We talk about affordable housing all the time, but we miss the fact that if we're talking about affordable housing, it means you have arguably unaffordable housing that people are in, which they're working somewhere. In Cherokee County, you're just shy of an 80% out-commute rate. Well, if you center those jobs nearer to those homes, if we're going to talk about how we bring homes to the people who are working in our community, we also have to talk about how we're bringing jobs to the people who live in our community. So it's a two-sided coin. I love teasing. Woodstock's a great place to live, work, and play. You just have to pick two. So I want you to be able to do not just live and play or not just work. Let's figure out how we combine those three things.
Since we are data geeks, the inflow in the 6 North Fulton cities is 94%.
Okay. Wow. Yep. Yeah, I know. We're sending people to you very
Thank
often. Hey, you come play with us. You can come bring the sales tax dollars to us all day, and we'll send them over to you for work.
So, Mayor, you participated in an Atlanta Regional Commission leadership program. Was it last year, I think?
Yes, ma'am. The worst acronym of all time, LHAC, the Local Leadership Housing Action Committee.
That sounds like a party group. So was this something discussed among other leaders? Were you already in process with this?
Yeah, both yes. We were already in process with this at the time. This was something Tracy had already at least conceptually presented to the council, and then Cam had been unleashed on. We did briefly discuss this during LHAC. I think they've actually spent more time discussing it in this year's cohort than we did last year. I'm also the vice chairman of the Atlanta Regional Commission as well. And so I think LHAC is now in its third, it is the worst acronym, LLHAC is in its third cohort, third year iteration. And it's a really neat opportunity, not just for leaders to sit and learn from experts in the field, but also to sit and just open table discuss. Hey, what are you doing in your, okay, no, that won't work in mine, and here's the why. And that was one of my favorite parts of that cohort, was being able to sit and not just talk about what are good ideas or bad ideas, but also, hey, maybe that is a great idea for you, but it actually isn't for me. And not just because of political reception or anything like that, but the communities in Metro Atlanta, it really is a mosaic of communities. And that's, I think, part of the strength of Atlanta. If you look at cities around the world that are cities of neighborhoods or boroughs, we're a city of cities here. And so I think that free market of cities through Metro Atlanta allows for us to meet issues like 1/3 housing unit deficit in a way that doesn't deliver one single inventory option as a major metro. We get to do this piecemealed in tailored, I'm a millennial, in bespoke ways from city to city.
So I know you've had requests for this. Do you see yourself being proactive with the residents about, here's something you could do to try to encourage this, or is it just on a request basis?
I think it's it's largely been organic. I don't think that we're proactively enforcing it. We put it out there. We make information readily available. We try to make it available in a format that is easily digestible. But I think the reception that's been had, the interest that's been shown, again, is largely organic. And there are a lot of people out there that are thinking about next steps when it comes to their boomerang kid, when it comes to their parents. I know my husband and I are having these discussions at home on the regular right now about our respective parents. So I don't think that this is something that we've necessarily had to force feed anyone or even proactively put forward into the community, because this is something that's on a lot of people's minds every 2 weeks when they balance their checkbook, or especially during the holiday season when they have parents coming to visit them or vice versa, and you're thinking about what the future may hold for, the next round of holidays.
But having said that, for every Woodstock listener out there, we have a really great ADU ordinance now. We would encourage you to
So one of the first things that comes up with ADUs is rental, and that has a connotation on the north end of less than desirable at times. A lot of cities are focused on a ratio of rental versus ownership, and you guys do it a little differently with multifamily rental versus other rental. Could you explain that?
Yeah, in our council policy manual right now, we identify multifamily rental as we have a target percentage for the city, and that's at 20% right now. We're actually just exceeding that, not significantly. I do philosophically like the generalized ownership-rentership ratio as a good metric to target. Historically, for 3 generations, it's been 65% ownership ratio nationwide. Our city sits right at 65% ownership ratio. So I think how you accomplish that and how you get there, pick your prize bag for the day. It really is a pick your own adventure. But as long as you're in that realm and you're floating around that metric, you hit that national average, and we continue to drive wealth for Woodstock families. I like ADUs as a rental tool in a huge way. I think rental inventory is an interesting inventory because it's organic and self-generating. So you don't have to construct rental inventory to increase rental inventory in your city. If you construct ownership inventory, by its very nature, a portion of it will convert to rental inventory. The difference is the odds of that being converted by someone who is also local or at least has a local interest is much higher than if you do it as an entire community all at one time built for the purpose of rental inventory. What you never see is rental inventory built and then convert that into individually owned inventory. And so I do think as local governments, I think we get a bad rap for being too focused on ownership inventory sometimes. I actually think that's an important balancing act against overcapitalization into rental inventory because that will grow organically. ADUs are a spectacular tool to increase organically that rental inventory in a way that relies on someone who is directly locally invested to continue to be a partner in that. And so if I can't build wealth for the family renting the unit because they're not inherently keeping the equity, if it instead just ships right next door to the unit on the same parcel, that's a huge win compared to shipping it out of town.
So do you have to have a permit to rent if you're not in an HOA or don't have any other?
No, in fact, I think that would violate state law.
Okay.
Yeah, this is another instance of when we can talk about what the ordinance does and what it doesn't do. I think what it doesn't do is, put any preclusions on rentals for homeowners that wish to rent them out. We do speak to owner occupancy, either living in the primary unit or the accessory dwelling unit. But the only mention of rental that the ordinance speaks to is regarding short-term rentals. And even still, it's not necessarily a preclusion, but just a requirement that if you have an ADU on your property and you wish to use it as a short-term rental, you need to have a homestead exemption on your existing primary dwelling unit. And I think the reason for that is, speaking of home ownership ratios, I think we could foresee when we were doing some tea leaves and some hypotheticals during the ordinance crafting process. Let's say a commercial entity comes in, takes a house, buys it, renovates it, builds an ADU on it. Then you're dealing with a situation where not only is the primary dwelling unit not owned by a living, breathing person, but the ADU that is rented out is not owned by a living, breathing person. So we're trying to focus and tailor the ADU experience to complement that home ownership and those goals set by the council.
So this is a little bit off the ADU track, but on the workforce housing, do you allow duplexes, triplexes, quads in the ordinance?
Yes, 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 albeit with a little bit of discretion. Attached housing product in the city usually needs to go through a conditional use permit process, which cradle to grave, you're looking at about a 90-day process that accumulates with review by city council. And I think that that's actually something that's on my list on a board in my office of things that I'd like to look at in the next couple of years, maybe loosening those restrictions, especially as it relates to the duplexes, the triplexes, and the quads. When you're dealing with wholesale townhome communities, a little bit different environment from a construction perspective. And I think to the extent that we might be able to create some allowances and some easier construction for those 2, 3, and 4 unit projects, that's something we'd like to do.
I think the city of Decatur just did some really unique work on that front, addressing the missing middle duplex, triplex permitting process too. So we're watching metro cities take that on and get serious about it.
So one last question, do you feel like the conversation around housing, affordable, workforce, assisted, supported, whatever you call it, is that a conversation that you hear among your residents? Is there a avenue that they're more supportive of than not?
Do you want to go first? Because I'm going to soapbox this one.
Absolutely. I think what to me is most fascinating is most folks don't even realize that they're having discussions about these topic areas, because for them it's personal. It's the parent who's struggling with some physical limitations that might require some services in close proximity. Again, the child that's coming back after college, the family member that's struggling to provide housing, the new homeowner who's trying to build equity and have some liquidity. These are all things that are being voiced to us as policymakers, as civil servants, but I don't think that a lot of those same people realize that the language they're speaking is actually urban planning and housing terminology that we're speaking on a daily basis as well. So I think one of my foremost goals is being able to connect the dots and create some pathways between the needs and the frustrations that the community is sharing when it comes to housing versus the work that we're doing on a daily basis to create that housing supply.
Yeah, I think it comes down to a quality of life perspective. People realize that, I want my quality of life to increase. And sometimes, this is a thing that has to do with government communication, which is, I think, one of the most difficult things that governments have to do. It comes down to, where are these conversations directing? Are they directing towards a attitude that says, okay, let's create a solution around this, or are they precluding other people from entering into housing markets? I think the answer to that lies in blurring the lines between housing typologies. It lies in, okay, let's move away from this existing single-family detached product that we have been accustomed to seeing in American housing markets and moving it more towards a mixture of housing types. I think that those are the pathways to achieve a increased quality of life for those folks. And I do agree with that. Like you said, it's very much, they don't realize they're doing planner speak, and it's lovely. It's lovely to hear it.
All American public policy is American housing policy. So when they are talking about public policy, they are talking about this issue, whether they realize it or not. And I think amongst the biggest misnomers we allow ourselves to get away with is that when we talk about things like affordable housing, we talk about workforce housing, I've even heard American dream housing. We are pretending like we're talking about a segment of housing that each of us as homeowners didn't benefit from already. Because the price I paid for my house years and years ago, everyone would kill to pay now for that house. And so this is not a subset or a segment of the population we're talking about. We are talking about exactly the engine we all engaged. So all of this is the same conversation. What we're really talking about is, do we believe in home ownership or not? Do we believe people should have access to a home that they own and the capital effects that come from that? I would posit that American capitalism relies on that being true. So if we're going to be serious about the future of the economy in this country, and if we're going to be serious about Pax Americana continuing in general, we get serious about this issue, period, the end. If we don't get serious about this issue, if we don't start adding and mixing inventory and creating a more accessible housing environment, then we just have to recognize that not only will the middle class in this country dissipate and change, our role in the world changes. This is it.
I think that credit given where credit due. I have the luxury and the privilege of working for a mayor and council that have watched Woodstock dramatically grow and change over the last 20 years. And there would have been a lot of people in my position that would have looked at the ADU ordinance and said to themselves, you know what, I really want to do some work on this, but I'm also afraid to open Pandora's box. And I'd be lying if I said there wasn't a moment where I thought maybe we should just leave it alone because they're allowed, albeit without a lot of guidance, but they're allowed. And if I go down this road, before it's all said and done, they could be disallowed in the code. And I don't want to be the person that, takes things back a step or two. But to be able to interact with this council and have them experience firsthand the sheer volume of change, physically, population, demographics, you name it, that Woodstock has undergone, it's made tackling some of these issues such a more illuminating experience because they've experienced this firsthand. They know the good and bad and the ugly that comes from this sort of radical transformation. And I think that they are all more open to getting very creative and understand that it's not just going to be a one-size top-down-fits-all approach to building the housing capacity that's needed to accommodate all of the people that live, work, and play in Woodstock on a daily basis. And so to that extent, I want to give mayor and council the credit due because that is not something that you experience in a lot of communities across the country.
Well, my ego thanks you. I will tell you, I think I shift that credit back to in a city that was 4,500 in 1990s, 40,000 today. It means 90% of the people came here, and they came largely because they wanted what was being built, and built in general just meaning created, right? We are creating a community, and it's so much fun to be in a place where the population showed up and is building that together. And so we get a very long leash out of the constituents in Woodstock, and there's a huge amount of responsibility that comes with that. You want to make sure not to abuse that trust, but we have a happy city. And as I heavily avoid naming names, but want to poke fun at North Fulton a little, every now and then y'all's political discourse looks less friendly than ours does. And so it's a lot of fun to be on a council of people who they absolutely disagree with on things, but they're willing to go grab a beer afterward and figure it out, and they don't carry it on to the next one. And to have a constituency that absolutely has opinions, but is willing to sit down and hear you out and recognize you're a neighbor and not some elected official from 800 miles away it's refreshing is the right way to say it. I spent 8 years in the Georgia House of Representatives before this job, and it's not always as clear-cut and friendly in the Gold Dome as it can be in the Woodstock City Council chambers. And so I am very grateful to get to work with a team of council members who are willing to sit down and look at it and recognize that we treat cities in this country today like consumables. We use them up, we make them too expensive, then move 5 miles further out. And the only people who are still there are the people who are stuck. And that, if we keep following the American pattern, Woodstock 20 years from now will have been a really cool place to be. And I think we've got a council and a staff who recognize that. We've got a constituency who recognizes, hey, if we want atypical results, we're going to have some atypical inputs. Let's go figure out what those creative solutions look like. Let's be on the forefront of figuring out how we lead in that. It's been a bold city before, and I don't see us stopping that. And that's been a fun place to be.
Well, we really appreciate that you're our neighbors and that you're doing these things and trying things out and figuring it out. So we have an opportunity to maybe pull from your successes and have those conversations in our area. And thank you all so much for being here. We really, really appreciate it.
Yes, thank you. And kudos to you all for looking at the KB study and not just looking at the $350,000 houses as your only constituents. Your opening statement of middle class is one that I hope everybody else starts looking at intentionally. And our listeners, when we talk about a call to action, that's one of the first things you should be doing is looking at Zillow or Redfin or look and see who can afford to live in our neighborhood. See if you think teachers can live here or firefighters or nurses, people who are essential to our well-being. If we price them out, then who knows what's happening to our health. Another call to action is get involved in your local comprehensive plan. All the 6 cities in North Fulton are getting ready to start, if they haven't already started talking to people. In Alpharetta, last cycle, they asked people's opinions, and they continue to do that. The top type of housing that we are missing in North Fulton was supported by 35 people. You don't have to have 5,000 people to influence the comprehensive plan. You just need to be involved. Please research, look at our website. We're starting to post the timelines for other cities because we need everybody to get involved and say what they have to say. But it's not a quick fix. It's not the kind of thing that'll happen overnight. Even if you look at the ADUs that are happening in Woodstock, it's going to take a while for that to really make an impact. But nevertheless, they're making an impact. So we want to help make that happen in North Fulton. Thank you all for joining us, and thank you all that are listening.
Jack, this has been great. And what a great conversation. Mayor Michael Caldwell, Tracy Albers, and Cameron Dunn, thanks again so much for coming in and sharing your thoughts and innovative ideas and successes. Congratulations on those successes.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Hey, folks, just a quick reminder that this show, North Fulton Voices, is presented by the North Fulton Improvement Network. North Fulton Voices is the go-to source for in-depth analysis and discussion of the missing middle housing issue and livability challenges that are confronting North Fulton. Continue to listen as we understand the implications of the problem, explore innovative solutions, and examine housing solutions like the ones we've discussed today, why they are vital for North Fulton's future. You can subscribe on your favorite podcast app, Apple, Spotify. We're on all the major podcast apps. And again, this show is sponsored and offered as a service to the community by yours truly, my company, John Ray. And I'm delighted to partner with the North Fulton Improvement Network to present this show. So for Jack Murphy, Nancy Diamond, I'm John Ray. Join us next time on North Fulton Voices.
Thank you for joining us on North Fulton Voices. This show is presented by the North Fulton Improvement Network, working to solve our community's workforce housing challenges. For more information, visit improvenorthfulton.org.